If you like my videos, subscribe and hit the like button. It's the only way now that the politicians and the media has gone that we can shine a light on our small community. And join our Facebook group, East Palestine Off the Rails. You can learn the truth from people that live here. Thank you so much. So I have a source that is a patient, and this patient was talking to Ann Vogel of the EPA. And this patient came in the same day that they were talking to Ms. Vogel. You might remember Ann Vogel as one of the people that was testifying in front of the Senate. My source was telling me about some of the things that Ann Vogel was saying was that, and my source did an imitation of her. My source said Ann Vogel sighed, kind of looked down to the ground, closed her eyes and shook her head and said, "There is a lot of liquid in that soil." Ann Vogel was referring to the liquid that Norfolk Southern so conveniently placed their tracks over and just ran their trains right through. And keep in mind, those of us who live in this area, we're used to a lot of trains coming through, but nothing like what was seen right after the tracks were put over that contaminated soil. Trains came one right after the other, just over and over and over again, day and night, because they were so backed up. And it's funny how if you just use common sense, sometimes things are so simple. Occam's razor. Things are as they appear. So I gave the theory on my last video where I was down at the park with all the aerators. I said to myself, why would there be so many aerators right now coinciding with them digging up the tracks? And I said in that video, they're releasing more chemicals into the creek. Well, my source tells me another thing that Ann Vogel said when my source asked why they're not addressing the lower ends of the creeks is because the source of all the chemicals is the crash site. There are so many chemicals still left in that site, in that soil, in that liquid, that it is just feeding the creeks below. And it would be futile to try to clean up the lower creeks without cleaning up the crash site first. That in itself gives you a good indication of how many deadly chemicals are still left in that soil as Norfolk Southern was driving right over them for a month. The reason I'm making this video is because I was just sent these photos of these massive tanks. Either my little town is getting a surprise visit from Shamu the whale, or there are a lot more chemicals under those tracks than the EPA or Norfolk Southern wants to admit. So I have a patient who works right near the crash site and he sees it on a daily basis. And he sent me these pictures. These were just built over the weekend and they're finishing up today. Those tanks are massive. There are two of these tanks that are being constructed and you can see the rubber liner, the blue liner that will encompass the inside to hold the liquid. Look at the sheer mass, the gargantuan size of these tanks. Look at the person on the left-hand side of the tank in the picture. Look how small he is in comparison to this tank. And there are two of them being constructed as I speak. How many hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid do those tanks hold? How many contaminants are they trying to pump out of that soil? And how much poison has already leached into our land? The sheer scale of what has been done to us is unforgivable. Time was of the essence. When they laid those tracks down over the contaminated soil, those poisons had more and more time to leach into our land. I remember we were all being told in the press conferences while we were all huddled in our spaces and evacuated from our homes that Norfolk Southern was going to dig down 25 feet below the tracks and remove all the soil and clean the area up. But they didn't tell us when. They are so smart. They were either never going to replace the tracks and dig underneath even though they said so, or they were going to wait as long as they could until someone forced their hands. I don't even think the EPA would have forced them because it took people like you to scream and yell, and townspeople not giving up, to force the EPA to force Norfolk Southern's hand. That's how corrupt this system is. They laid the tracks over contaminated soil, hoping to never have to remediate the site.
You son of a bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones!
Norfolk Southern was supervised by the EPA, who admittedly was on site 2 hours after the initial derailment. And per the EPA's own admission by their initial report was that they observed Norfolk Southern putting tracks over contaminated soil. I submit that the EPA is just as guilty. Why would they allow them to do so? And now they're going to try to extract all that liquid, all that poison, all those deadly chemicals out of our soil. I don't think that's going to happen. Let's take one last look at the massive scale of these holding tanks, and we will finish up with some Senate testimony.
Why Norfolk Southern was so busy assembling those rails to get their track moving. Why were they not putting plans into place and mitigation efforts to control the chemicals? Why were they not damming it up somehow to prevent that from getting into our waterways and the chemicals getting into our waterways? They were using all of their resources and their money to get their rail reassembled so they could move that train through as soon as the evacuation order was lifted. Trains rolled through our town while fires were still burning. Families were still away from their homes. All they cared about was getting that train moving down those tracks. They did not care about us.